The message arrived at 3:47 GMT. It was a simple line of text, a declaration sent directly to Earth's global defense networks. A gauntlet thrown down by the Varine Imperium, the galaxy's most ruthless and technologically advanced empire. The transmission was terse, cold, clinical. Their intentions could not have been clearer. War. Prepare for annihilation. And just like that, humanity's fragile peace was shattered. The Varine had long been a name spoken in hushed tones, a myth of cold efficiency and relentless expansion. Earth had long ignored their growing presence, content in the illusion of peace. But no longer. By dawn, the consequences were clear. At 6:23, the first blast hit Jakarta. The Varine's forward fleet moved in fast, leaving nothing in its wake but molten ruins. Plasma lances shot from their ships, splitting the skyline as the city's infrastructure collapsed. The attack was swift, ruthless, and efficient. As Jakarta burned, Varine ships in orbit moved like locusts, raining destruction down on the cradle of Southeast Asia. Mumbai followed shortly after, the same fate befalling one of Earth's most populous cities. The pattern was simple: glass the world, destroy everything in sight, send a clear message of their superiority. Surrender was never an option. On Earth's NATO listening post, nestled in the cold silence of an abandoned military station, far from the chaos of the major capitals, Dax Renor stared at the monitor in disbelief. His fingers hovered over the console, his breath shallow as he processed what he was seeing. Dax had long been an outcast, a voice dismissed as paranoid and irrelevant by high-ranking military officials, but now his warnings were all too real. He was an astrophysicist, not a soldier. He was never meant to be in this position. Yet there he was, staring at a Varine fleet, tearing through the Earth's defenses like paper. Their weapons were incomprehensible to him, seamlessly coordinated, too advanced for even Earth's best minds to predict. He glanced at his screen, at the orbital feeds. The human military was scrambling to respond. The railgun platforms fired their massive kinetic slugs toward the Varian destroyers, but the kinetic shields on the alien ships absorbed the impacts with no visible damage. Missiles, the last resort of Earth's countermeasures, detonated uselessly against the Varian's energy shields. In moments, the global defense networks turned into a chaotic mess of scrambled communication as Earth's military tried to reorganize, trying to deploy forces that had long been in disarray. Fleets rushed to engage, but the Varine's superior technology had already made them irrelevant. Dax Renor leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The weight of the years of dismissal, the years of being labeled a madman, a paranoid astrophysicist, crushed him. He had warned them all. He had seen the flaw. It had come to him years ago, when he was still part of the NATO research team, before his exile. He had predicted it, tested it in simulations. The Varine's quantum drive harmonics were too perfect, too synchronized. Their fleets moved as one, an elegant, flawless machine that bent space itself to their will. But perfection breeds predictability. And predictability, Dax had warned, was their fatal flaw. He remembered the meeting, the exact moment they had laughed him out of the room. The Varine fleet was untouchable, they had said. His theory of a synchronization fault was nonsense. It wasn't a flaw in their systems. It was just the way the universe worked. Humanity's attempts to challenge their power were irrelevant, and now Earth was paying the price for that arrogance. The clock ticked in the silence of his control room, the only sound accompanying the flashing feeds of devastation. Dax's eyes narrowed as he thought through the data in front of him. The Varine's attacks were brutal and overwhelming, but they weren't unpredictable. There was still time. His thoughts shifted. Could he do it? Could he actually stop them? On Earth, cities burned. The remaining survivors huddled in shelters, unsure if they would see the next hour, the next day. Military forces from across the globe began to coalesce, but it was too late. The Varine Imperium had made its move. Their dominance was absolute, their strategy flawless. Humanity was but a speck of dust, outmatched and outgunned. But Dax Renor saw something others didn't. He knew the weakness in the Varians' harmony, their beautifully constructed system. There was a flaw, a weak point buried deep within their quantum technology. If he could exploit that, maybe, just maybe, humanity would stand a chance. He began to type, fingers moving frantically over the keys, bringing up the files he'd worked on years ago. His old work, the research he had been discredited for, now felt like his last hope. The synchronization fault. If he could trigger it, if he could cause their quantum drives to falter, maybe he could buy humanity some time. The question was, could he do it in time? In space, the Varine fleet advanced relentlessly, undeterred by the minimal resistance Earth's forces offered. Hundreds of ships moved in unison, an unstoppable force. They didn't care about cities or infrastructure. The goal was simple: eradicate humanity. And yet, on the fringes of the conflict, one man, a disgraced scientist, was about to become humanity's greatest hope. Alone and without support, he was facing an empire far beyond Earth's technological understanding. But his mind was sharp, and his theory had always been sound. Dax stared at the screen one last time. The feed from the Varine fleet displayed their synchronized movements, the precision of their attack. The war had only just begun, but the Varine were already claiming victory. Earth's defenses were helpless, and it seemed as though humanity was doomed. But Dax Renor knew something they didn't. A flaw in the perfect system, a weakness buried deep in the heart of the Varine's technology. It was time to turn the tide. The sun barely broke over the horizon as Jakarta and Mumbai burned in the distance. The news feeds were filled with images of entire cities reduced to ashes. Flickers of flame in the early morning light as Varine plasma lasers tore through the atmosphere with terrifying precision. The shock of it all made Earth's defense systems freeze for a moment. There was no time to process, no time to prepare. In Earth's last military command center, the once dead lines of communication lit up with frantic messages and scrambled orders. Humanity's remaining fleet, what was left of it after years of underfunding and political neglect, struggled to assemble any coherent defense. The war had come too suddenly, and even more damning, the Varine were too powerful. Their weapons were surgical, their ships moving like a force of nature, too precise and too overwhelming to withstand. Earth's remaining railgun platforms fired in rapid succession, but their kinetic projectiles seemed laughable against the Varine's kinetic shields, which absorbed every hit without so much as a ripple. Missiles were launched, but plasma shields flickered across the Varine's fleets, shrugging off each strike. Ships, once designed to defend the planet, were now sitting ducks. Humanity had nothing left to throw at them but desperation. On the outskirts of command, deep inside a forgotten NATO listening post, Dax Renor watched the scenes unfold, his eyes glued to the monitors. The quantum signatures of the Varine fleet were easy to pick out even from his dilapidated station. He'd seen their ships before, in simulations he'd run years ago when he'd been a respected scientist. Before the universe's arrogance had turned him into an exile. The human military had dismissed him, his warnings laughed off, his research neglected. But today, as the sky cracked open with alien fire, it was his knowledge they would need. The reports from the World Defense Network were grim. Cities shattered, lives lost, and the Varine's relentless advance was unstoppable. Yet amidst the chaos, a small part of Dax's mind was working, calculating, analyzing, searching for the flaw he had discovered long ago, the flaw that could stop them. Synchronization. It was no secret that the Varine fleet operated with impeccable coordination, moving as a single unit in perfect harmony. Their ships were more than just warships. They were a well-oiled machine, connected by a quantum system so advanced that no one had figured out how to break it. But Dax had. He had seen the quantum drive harmonics. The way their ship's drives were perfectly aligned, each one dependent on the other. It was like a perfectly tuned orchestra, a flaw in the system that could bring everything crashing down. The question was, could he disrupt it in time? Dax hesitated only for a moment. The old doubts that had plagued him for years, the ones that had gotten him exiled in the first place, flickered at the back of his mind. But this wasn't about his past. This wasn't about his failures. This was about the world he had been forced to watch burn. He tapped the old satellite systems on his screen, activating a disrupted channel that had been left to gather dust for years. The military had long abandoned these systems, thinking them obsolete. But they were still there, hiding in plain sight. Dax smiled grimly, his fingers flying over the keys. His disruption signal would target the Varine quantum system directly, broadcasting a frequency designed to throw off their perfectly synchronized drives. The flaw was simple, elegant, and subtle. It wouldn't immediately destroy the fleet. It wouldn't burn their ships to a crisp. But it would introduce enough chaos to make them vulnerable. As he hit enter, the broadcast began. The signal spread through the Varine system, a ripple of energy designed to bypass their precision. For a moment, nothing happened. The Varine fleet continued its advance, the orbital bombardments continuing without pause, but Dax knew the algorithm had been set into motion. It took several long minutes, but the first sign of success came when one of the Varine destroyers misfired. Instead of delivering its usual laser strike, its weapon systems glitched, sending a plasma blast into space. The ship, now off course, collided with another. A misfire in the carefully synchronized formation. Then it spread. 2 more ships collided, the chaos beginning to ripple through the fleet. The perfect machine, so precise in its actions, was slowly being undone by the smallest of imperfections. The ships began to drift out of sync. Some broke formation entirely, no longer able to track their own movements. In space, where every second counted, the smallest discrepancy was enough to turn the tide. Admiral Korvath, observing the chaos from his flagship, issued a series of commands that, to his dismay, went ignored. His crew's tactical displays were showing that their systems were failing. Ships in formation were no longer following the path they had been programmed to follow. The ships were now moving erratically, misfiring, locking onto the wrong targets, and creating confusion within their ranks. For a species so used to operating in perfect unity, it was a nightmare. From Earth's remaining railgun platforms, a new wave of firepower was unleashed. This time, the Varine shields weren't as strong. With the fleet's synchronization faltering, the shield systems were less effective at stopping the kinetic projectiles that slammed into the Varine ships. The first explosions erupted in low orbit, and Dax's heart pounded. His plan was working. Against all odds. The Varine's perfect formation was slipping. Chaos spread like wildfire, and now Earth's remaining weapons had a chance. The railguns fired again, their tungsten slugs punching through the weakened shields of the Varine ships. For the first time since the Varine's invasion began, Earth's forces were on the offensive. Dax Renor watched as the battlefield shifted before his eyes. On one screen, the devastation of Earth's cities still burned brightly. On another, the Varine fleet was fragmenting, their precise movements unraveling in real time. The Varine had been invincible, unstoppable. But now the human defense, chaotic and fractured as it was, had found a weak point. Dax looked at the countdown on his terminal, the Varine fleet still advancing, but now they were vulnerable. The disruption wasn't enough to defeat them yet, but it was enough to stall them, to create confusion and disorder, and in the midst of that chaos, humanity had a chance. He sat back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the monitors. The first signs of victory were small, but they were there. They weren't much, but it was enough. It was a start. And for the first time, humanity had hope, a glimmer in the dark. The battle was far from over. The Varine's fleet still loomed large, but now, for the first time, humanity had the upper hand. Chaos erupted in the Varine fleet as the pulse of Dax's signals spread through their systems. The Varine, once a seamless force of perfect coordination, began to stutter. One ship fired its weapons, only to watch them veer off course and slam into a fellow vessel. Another ship, caught in the ripple of the disruption, drifted helplessly out of formation. Third ship, a colossal destroyer, miscalculated its trajectory and collided with a smaller frigate, sending both ships spiraling in an uncontrolled tumble through space. The Varine Imperium, built on precision and coordination, was now splintering in real time. The fleet's harmonics, once flawless, began to falter. Tactical displays that had been calibrated to perfection now showed nothing but disarray. Varine ships collided, fired upon their own allies, and drifted aimlessly. A war machine that had once been so predictable, so utterly dominant, was now nothing more than a chaotic mess. For the first time, the Varine fleet was vulnerable. In the command center of the flagship Siphon, Admiral Korvath stood frozen, his piercing gaze locked onto the warship's main tactical screen. His entire fleet, his pride, his weapon of conquest, was falling apart before his eyes. Confusion spread through the ranks like a virus. His crew scrambled to regain control, but every attempt seemed to worsen the situation. Varine ships were failing to engage at their full potential, misfiring on targets, and worse, some were locking on to empty. The damage to their formations was irreparable. "Status report." Korvath's voice boomed across the deck. His tactical officers scrambled for answers, their voices rising in panic. "We've lost synchronization across the fleet, sir. Targeting systems are malfunctioning," one officer reported, her hands flying across the console in vain. Korvath's fist slammed down on the armrest of his chair, the metal screeching under the force. He couldn't afford this kind of disorder, not now. The Imperium's plan was flawless, its tactics impeccable, but this was something they hadn't accounted for. "Redirect half the fleet. Send a strike force to neutralize the source of the signal." His voice was cold, precise, despite the chaos unfolding around him. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about regaining control. It was about stamping out the threat at its core. He couldn't let this human astrophysicist's sabotage ruin everything. Meanwhile, Dax Renor was sitting in the same control room, his fingers frozen over his terminal. The Varine's retaliation was inevitable. The strike force would come for him, and when they did, they would have every resource at their disposal to wipe him out. Dax had expected this, of course. He had hoped for it, even. A retaliation would validate his theory, prove that the disruption was indeed working. But at what cost? The Varine had targeted the origin of the signal, his decommissioned NATO listening post. He wasn't trained for combat. He wasn't prepared for a military engagement. The best he could do was outsmart them, buy more time, hope that Earth's remaining railguns, the last bastion of humanity's defense, could take advantage of this window of opportunity. The retaliatory strike arrived fast. The Varine fleet was sending everything they had, and they weren't going to miss this time. In the distance, Dax saw the telltale signs of Varine warships changing course, moving in on his position. The strike force had been dispatched, and Dax's station was their primary target. Panic surged through him, but he quickly squashed it. Focus. His eyes darted between the orbital feeds, watching the Varine formations shift and break, watching Earth's remaining assets try to hold the line. The orbital railguns were still firing, humanity's last chance, the last thread of defense. He pressed a button on his console, activating an old decommissioned satellite array. The array was rudimentary, an ancient piece of technology long forgotten, but it could jam incoming Varine signals. It wasn't a direct defense against their advanced weaponry, but it would buy time. Time for the railguns to continue their assault on the Varine's failing shields. It was the only chance Earth had. Dax's hands shook as he reconfigured the frequencies on the fly, trying to keep the jamming signal strong enough to disrupt the incoming wave without overloading the satellites. The seconds felt like hours, but he pressed on, the hum of the machinery around him merging with the constant thrum of his thoughts. The Varine strike force was drawing closer. Dax had minutes, maybe seconds, before they would hit. His heart raced, but his mind was calm, calculating. He could do this. He had to. As the Varian ships neared, the first signs of success came. The Varian targeting systems, already shaky, started to malfunction again. Their ships, once perfectly coordinated, began to misfire once more. A destroyer veered off course, its plasma blast missed completely, striking only empty space. Then another ship, caught in the wake of the signal's effect, lost its shield projections at a critical moment, and Earth's railguns struck true. A crack echoed through the tactical readouts as the Varine warship's shields failed under the impact. The tungsten rods punched through the hull, detonating on impact. The Varine's ship staggered, breaking apart in a burst of sparks and fire. "Direct hit!" one of the officers in Earth's command center shouted in disbelief. It was the first sign of real success. The Varine fleet was out of sync, and Earth's remaining defenses were taking advantage of it. The momentary window that Dax had created was paying off. But time was running out. As the strike force closed in, Dax realized the urgency of his position. He had disrupted the Varine fleet's harmony, yes, but now the retaliation was coming full force. He had no defense against their weapons, no way to fight back other than his knowledge and the time he had bought. In the sky above, the Varine ships began to converge, their weapons charging. Dax's eyes scanned the feeds one last time. His disruption was still working. For now. The Varine fleet was misfiring, losing cohesion. But Earth's counteroffensive would only last as long as the disruption signal held. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time humanity had a chance. The retaliatory strike loomed large, but as the Varine fleet faltered, Dax could see it. The tide was turning. It wasn't just about the destruction of Earth anymore. The Varine's power, once unquestionable, was fracturing. A weak point had been exposed. And Dax? He was the one who had found it. The air around Dax buzzed with tension, thick with the weight of everything that was about to unfold. He could see the Varine fleet in the distance, a menacing line of ships, their coordinated assault now thrown into chaos. But they weren't done. Not by a long shot. The strike force was closing in fast. Admiral Korvath had seen enough. His fleet, though still reeling from the disruption Dax had caused, was a juggernaut. Powerful, relentless. The Varine commander knew exactly what to do next. He would end this. The Varine Imperium wasn't going to let a single human outsmart them, not after all these years. From his flagship, Korvath's orders rang out. Initiate kinetic bombardment. Target the source of the signal. The full force of his fleet, what was left of it, moved into position. The Varine had taken a hit, but they weren't broken. Their weapons were still deadly, and their sheer size and might could crush anything that stood in their path. The remaining human defenses were scattered, vulnerable. The Varine ships began charging their plasma cannons, weapons designed to shatter planets, ready to obliterate Dax's NATO listening post and everything in the vicinity. Dax's signal, the thing that had started this madness, had to be neutralized. Korvath had no intention of letting this human outcast ruin everything. Dax's screen flickered as his own position lit up on the Varine's targeting systems. He had bought them time, yes, but now the storm was coming. The Varine fleet was aiming everything they had directly at him. There was no way to hide, no place to run. His heart raced as he stared at the orbital display, watching the Varine fleet's ships coalesce into perfect firing formations. A final strike. In the distance, the Varine's flagship initiated its strike. As Korvath had predicted, the kinetic bombardment would be devastating. Dax could feel the weight of it coming. A flood of plasma fire headed straight toward him. His fingers flew over his console, trying to reroute power to his defense systems, but the station was too old, its tech too outdated. He had one last option, one last chance. The disruption signal he had created was still functional, still flickering in the background of the chaos. But it wasn't enough. The Varine fleet was already recalibrating, and their systems would soon resync. Dax had no time left. The Varine were on the cusp of destroying everything. He activated his final sequence, the resonance loop. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing left that could potentially overload the quantum harmonics entirely. Dax's fingers moved with precision, though his mind raced. Could he really do it? Could he disrupt the Varine's entire fleet with this final move? The stakes had never been higher. On Earth's side, the last remnants of humanity's defense were pushing back as best they could. Railguns still fired, hammering the Varine shields, though their strength had begun to wane after the initial hits. Strike groups, little more than splintered fleets of damaged ships, kept attacking the Varine wherever they could find an opening. But the Varine retaliated with brutal efficiency. Plasma fire rained down from above, splitting the night sky with blinding light. Human ships were shattered under the relentless barrage. But Earth's surviving fleet wasn't about to let go. Humanity wasn't going down without a fight. Then, out of the blackness of space, the dagger appeared. Earth's last stealth destroyer. It was barely operational, its hull scarred, its weapon systems malfunctioning, but it had one purpose left, to hold the line for just a little longer. The dagger moved forward, engaging in a desperate suicide run against the oncoming Varine fleet. Its railguns fired at the nearest Varine ships, the shots weakening their already damaged shields. Every shot, every explosion, was one step closer to humanity's final chance. The dagger's engines screamed as it surged forward, its hull cracking under the strain, but it wasn't stopping. With a final, earth-shattering impact, the dagger collided with a Varine destroyer, tearing a hole in its hull before both ships erupted in a blinding explosion. The dagger had done its job. It had bought Dax the time he needed. Dax's heart skipped a beat as the countdown on his screen reached 0. The resonance loop initiated, its algorithms whirling into action. The disruption signal was no longer just an interference, it had become a force of its own. The Varine's synchronization was now completely at odds with reality. Their quantum systems couldn't keep up with the overload. The first ship in the fleet to feel the full brunt of Dax's calculated assault was the flagship. A single pulse of gravitational distortion erupted from the core, rippling outward, twisting the ship's hull and snapping it like a twig. Nearby cruisers, caught in the wave, followed suit, imploding, their quantum drives failing spectacularly, collapsing inward as if the very fabric of space itself was rejecting their presence. In the space around them, the Varine fleet started to fall apart. Ships no longer moved with deadly precision. The quantum drives of countless vessels began to overload one by one, their structures buckling, hulls torn apart by the energy that had once kept them intact. The Varine had lost control. There were no clean explosions, no dramatic fireballs. Instead, the ships collapsed inward in silent implosions, grotesque contortions of metal, as if reality itself had bent under the pressure of Dax's attack. "It's working," Dax whispered, his voice hoarse, filled with disbelief. He stared at the screens as the Varine fleet crumbled. On Earth, the surviving forces moved in. The Varine fleet, once a force so immense that Earth's defenses had seemed futile, was now disintegrating. Humanity's last strike groups pressed forward with renewed vigor, boarding crippled Varine ships, fighting through their twisted hulls in close-range combat. The battle had turned from a massacre into something that resembled a rout. The Varine command network was cut off. The ships drifted, stranded and broken, no longer the formidable threat they once were. Korvath's flagship, now an inert husk in space, floated helplessly. The Varine's command signal had been severed. The once mighty war machine, the one that had moved as a single unit across the stars, was now a shattered wreckage, no longer able to function. The final strike, the one that had been meant to destroy Earth, had instead ended in utter defeat for the Varine. The remnants of Earth's fleet advanced. They fired off the last of their railgun charges, but it wasn't necessary. The Varine had already lost. In space, the battlefield was a graveyard. littered with the wreckage of an empire's pride. What had started as an unstoppable invasion had turned into a disaster, not just for the Varine, but for the Galactic Imperium itself. The human victory was not just in the ships destroyed, nor in the number of lives spared. It was in the fact that humanity had fought back, with nothing but logic, wit, and courage. They had turned the Varine's arrogance into their greatest weapon. The cold silence of space was all that remained as the final echoes of the battle faded. What had been a thriving Varine fleet, a symbol of unimaginable power and efficiency, now drifted in the emptiness, broken and disintegrating. Thousands of ships, once the pride of an empire that had held the galaxy in its iron grip, floated aimlessly, torn apart from within by the very technology they had relied on. The once imposing warships, engineered for annihilation, now looked like broken carcasses of a beast that had overestimated its own strength. There was no victory parade, no fanfare, just the quiet aftermath of a devastation too large to comprehend. The Varine fleet had collapsed, not under the weight of a superior force, but under the weight of their own hubris. They had relied on their unmatched technology, their flawless synchronization, only to be undone by the very flaw humanity had discovered: predictability. The ships that had once seemed invincible, floating in perfect unity, now drifted apart in chaos. The Varine had been crushed, not by strength, but by the intellect of one man, the disgraced scientist Dax Renor. News of the Varine's defeat spread quickly. The Galactic Dominion had once feared the Varine, an empire so powerful that no one had dared challenge them, but now their once mighty fleet was reduced to wreckage, their superiority shattered in a matter of days. Systems across the galaxy that had once bent to the Varine's will began to stir, their populations awakening from the long, dark shadow of conquest. Across the universe, from the fringes of the Outer Rim to the heart of the Varine's subject worlds, a new hope began to take root. Rebellions sparked in places once thought unassailable. Worlds that had been subjugated for centuries rose up, emboldened by the unlikeliest of victories. Earth had not been destroyed, but had struck back, not with brute force, but with the brilliance of human intelligence. The Varine Imperium had been dealt a blow so severe that its collapse became inevitable. Earth's resistance was the spark that set the galaxy's revolution in motion. Back on Earth, the recovery was already underway. The Varine's technology, salvaged from the wreckage of their shattered fleet, was quickly put to use. The human race, long considered technologically inferior, now had the tools to defend itself. Humanity's surviving military forces, battered and beaten but resolute, worked alongside scientists to reverse engineer the Varine's quantum technology, fortifying planetary defenses and securing Earth's place in the galaxy. Earth's spacefaring capabilities skyrocketed as the remnants of the Varine fleet were mined for parts. Railgun tech, shields, energy weapons, and even the Varine's own quantum drives were carefully dismantled and understood. The human race wasn't just surviving, it was adapting, turning alien power into human advantage. But with this new strength came the daunting realization: Earth was no longer just an innocent bystander in galactic affairs. Humanity was now a force to be reckoned with. As the news of Earth's success spread, Dax Renor's role in the victory became more widely known. His discovery had turned the tide, and his brilliant insight had led to the Varine's downfall. But for all the recognition, there was no celebration for Dax. Instead, there was controversy. He had always been an outsider, his warnings laughed at, his theories dismissed. Now he was the man who had saved Earth, but at what cost? Dax had never sought glory. In fact, the attention made him uncomfortable. He hadn't wanted to be a hero, and yet here he was, the man who had brought the most powerful empire in the galaxy to its knees. Despite being offered commendations, even a permanent position in the newly formed Earth Defense Council, Dax refused. The accolades, the recognition, it didn't matter to him. What mattered was that humanity had survived. That was his victory, and that was enough. The controversy over Dax's role simmered, Some hailed him as a genius, the savior of Earth, while others wondered about the ethical implications of his actions. After all, he hadn't been part of the military. He had been exiled, labeled a failure, and yet he had been the one to solve the Varian puzzle. Some saw his decision to use his knowledge against the Varian as selfless, while others questioned whether they had been right to place their trust in a man once cast aside. But for Dax, it didn't matter. His name would live on, not as a decorated soldier, not as a hero of the people, but as someone who had chosen to think, to question the impossible, and to turn that knowledge into humanity's salvation. And yet, despite the world's newfound respect, Dax vanished from the public eye. He refused the accolades, the military honors. He wasn't interested in the politics of Earth's new position in the galaxy. Instead, he quietly disappeared, returning to the quiet corners of space where the world wouldn't find him again. But his legacy remained. The galaxy would remember the day that humanity fought back, not with strength or brute force, but with intellect and resilience. And as the Varian Imperium collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, the galaxy began to shift. The rebellions that had sparked in the wake of Earth's victory began to spread, and the Dominion's once unquestioned authority crumbled. Earth, battered but united, had become the beacon of a new era of resistance. It wasn't a simple fight for survival. It was a fight for freedom, and humanity had won it. The galaxy wouldn't forget the Varian's defeat, not just because of the loss of their fleet, but because humanity had shown the galaxy that even the greatest empire could be brought down not through brute strength, but through intelligence, courage, and a willingness to stand against the impossible. And Dax? His final legacy was more than just a man's quiet defiance. It was a reminder to the universe that humans didn't just survive, they adapted, they fought, and most importantly, they never gave up. They had won not because they were stronger, but because they refused to let their enemies win. Humanity's victory was a victory for all species who had been crushed by empires. It was a declaration that no one was invincible, not the Varian, and not any other empire that thought it could rule the stars without consequence. The galaxy had changed. Earth had survived, and humanity would no longer be a species on the brink of extinction. It would now shape the future. The fall of the Varian fleet wasn't just a military defeat. It was a shockwave that spread across the galaxy, rattling empires, shaking systems, and forcing even the most powerful beings in the universe to rethink everything they thought they knew about humanity. The Varian Imperium, which had stood for centuries as an unchallenged force of conquest, was now a broken empire. Its invincible fleet, shattered by the very force it had sought to crush, lay in ruins. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the Variants' humiliation echoed across the galaxy. News of the destruction reached the farthest corners of their empire, and the reaction was swift. Subject worlds that had been long subjugated by the Varians' iron fist began to stir, their peoples rising up against the authority that had long oppressed them. It started with small pockets of resistance, scattered groups of rebels who had previously been crushed by the Varians' might, but now, fueled by the impossible victory of Earth, they found new strength. The first rebellion erupted in the Sadrith cluster, a system once under the total control of the Varian. The workers, long silenced and crushed under the Varian's authoritarian rule, found their voices in the aftermath of the Varian's collapse. What had been a small insurgency turned into an organized uprising as Varian garrisons were overwhelmed by the sheer will of the people. The Varian had assumed that their authority was absolute, but Earth's victory had shattered that illusion. If humanity could defeat them using only intelligence and wit, then what could the Varian subjects not do with the same resolve? One by one, systems previously thought loyal to the Varian began to question their place in the Imperium. The Dominion, which had long stood unchallenged, was starting to crack. The revolt spread like wildfire. Even former allies of the Varian began to reconsider their allegiances. The Farnath system, once a staunch supporter of the Vereen, witnessed a mass defection, their military fleets now fighting alongside rebels, not the Imperium. Solarian sectors, which had held out in the shadow of Vereen oppression for years, now declared their independence, breaking away from the failing regime. Dax's discovery, the flaw in the Vereen's perfect synchronization, had not only destroyed their fleet, it had sparked something far greater, a revolution. The humiliation of the Vereen had spread beyond Earth. In the eyes of many, humanity was no longer a species that existed on the fringe of the galaxy. No longer was Earth considered the weak, forgotten planet. Instead, they were now seen as a force of nature, capable of outsmarting even the most advanced civilizations. The galaxy had been forced to reckon with a new reality. Dax, the one who had seen the flaw, was no longer just a disgraced scientist. The very thing that had made him an outcast had now made him a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the idea that even the smallest species in the universe could challenge the giants. Across the galaxy, the story of Dax Renor, a man once shunned and dismissed, was now told as legend. He had brought down the Vereen fleet, not with weapons, not with military force, but with the sheer force of his intellect. The galaxy had learned a harsh lesson: never underestimate humanity. In the Imperial High Command, the panic was palpable. Admiral Korvath had survived, but he knew the collapse of the fleet had been the beginning of the end. The Varians' unshakable confidence had been their downfall. Their reliance on perfection, the idea that their military machine could never fail, was exposed as an illusion. With factions within the Varian Imperium starting to crumble, their stronghold began to weaken. Rebel factions within the Imperium's military ranks started to coalesce. The once unstoppable war machine was now a fragmented empire, its leaders scrambling to maintain control as more and more subject worlds declared their independence. The Vereen's power was slipping. Entire fleets that had once terrorized the galaxy were now fighting rebellions on every front. Korvath could feel the pressure mounting as whispers of revolt turned into full-scale defiance. Admiral Korvath knew that the Vereen were no longer feared. They were now the underdogs, a broken empire, fighting not to expand but to survive. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the shift in humanity's position was undeniable. Dax's victory had done more than just save Earth. It had elevated humanity's place in the galaxy. No longer considered weak or primitive, humans were now viewed with respect and a little fear. The Vereen's defeat had made one thing clear: humanity was no longer to be ignored. Earth's technological advancements, thanks to Vereen salvage, made them a force in galactic politics, and that wasn't something the other species could ignore. The human response to the new galactic landscape was swift. Earth's recovery was marked by rapid expansion. With the technology gained from the Vereen wreckage, humanity was quickly assembling a military force capable of holding their own against any invader. Dax's plan had worked, but his true legacy wasn't in the physical weapons humanity now possessed. It was in the mindset he had given to the galaxy. Across the galaxy, other species began to ask themselves, if humans could defeat the Vereen, could they defeat us too? What had seemed impossible for so long was now reality. Humanity had not just survived, they had shown that they could outthink the most advanced civilization in the universe. Their reputation had changed from fragile to formidable. The Vereen Imperium was crumbling, and the galaxy, once under their iron-fisted rule, was now shifting. Revolution was no longer a distant hope, it was happening. The ripple that started with Earth's unexpected victory had become a tidal wave. The Vereen's defeat wasn't just a military loss, it was a philosophical defeat. The universe now understood that strength was no longer only defined by ships, weapons, or fleets. It was defined by ideas, by the willingness to challenge the status quo. And humanity had done that. Dax Renor had sparked a revolution, not just with technology, but with thought, with courage, with the idea that no matter how small, no matter how insignificant a species might seem, they could still change the course of history. The Varines' humiliation was the first step, but it was just the beginning. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, and now they were beginning to realize humanity wasn't just a weak species at the edge of the universe. The Varine Imperium had never known defeat, not in its 100-year reign, not in its decades of conquest. But now, with the collapse of their fleet, the rebellion brewing within their own ranks, and their once absolute control over the galaxy slipping away, their High Command had no choice but to act. The Varine High Command gathered for their final attempt to reclaim the Empire. They had lost their fleet. They had lost their grip on power. The rebellions were spreading, the vassal worlds were breaking free, and the Varines' authority was crumbling faster than they could contain it. But there was still one last weapon in their arsenal, a weapon of desperation. Admiral Korvath, the architect of the Varine fleet's power, stood on the bridge of his flagship, his face grim but determined. The losses they had suffered were immense, but the Varine Imperium still had one last chance to retake the galaxy. His fingers traced the edge of a datapad displaying the strategic layout of the galaxy, worlds lost, fleets scattered, but still, the Imperium was not yet finished. "Activate the final counteroffensive," Korvath barked, his voice steady despite the panic surrounding him. "All remaining forces regroup. We will crush the rebellion once and for all." It was a gamble, but Korvath knew there was no other choice. The rebel factions that had arisen, particularly the Draxar and former Imperium defectors, had gained too much ground. They had been encouraged by Earth's unexpected victory, and their morale was at an all-time high. If the Varine couldn't push back now, the Imperium would disintegrate. Earth's alliance of rebels, with humanity leading the charge, was too powerful to ignore. The Varine counterattack was swift. Korvath sent out his remaining fleets, strategically positioning them across key systems, hoping to launch a coordinated strike against Earth's forces. Their goal was simple: crush the rebellion, regain control, and silence the insurgency. The last remnants of the Varine fleet were rallied together, but the disarray in their ranks was apparent. The rebellion had already taken a foothold across the galaxy, and even Varine defectors who had joined Earth's ranks were now acting as the Varine's worst nightmare. The Imperium's finest weapon was now the most vulnerable it had ever been. Korvath didn't expect an easy battle. He knew the rebels were formidable, but what he didn't account for was the depth of humanity's resolve, the incredible adaptability of the Draxar and the Varan defectors that had abandoned their cause in disgust. Humanity's technology, now enhanced by Varan salvage, was being used against them in ways they hadn't imagined. This was the minute the things they had to despair had been done. Earth's forces mobilized quickly, forming a defensive line at the heart of the galaxy, preparing for the final confrontation. Using Varine technology they had scavenged from the wreckage of the first battle, Earth's combined fleets, armed with Varine weapons, were ready. They had learned how to use their enemies' strengths against them, and for the first time they were fighting back on equal terms. The railguns that had previously been Earth's sole defense were now joined by plasma cannons, energy shields, and quantum drives recovered from the wreckage. The human military was no longer the underdog. They had become a formidable force, built from the debris of the Varine's own arrogance. Dax Renor's discovery had turned the tide, but now it was Earth's will to prevail that would determine the outcome. Varine defectors, including Draxar warriors and former Imperium officers, fought side by side with the humans they had once considered enemies. Their knowledge of the Varine fleet was invaluable, allowing Earth's forces to exploit every weak point in their once unstoppable military machine. The first shots of the counteroffensive rang out like a thunderclap across the void. Varine ships charged forward, their weapons firing with ruthless efficiency. But the Varine rebellion within their own ranks was more than just a weakening of morale. It was the beginning of their undoing. Defected Varine warships turned their weapons on their former comrades, breaking their formations and sowing further confusion among the fleet. The Varine's counterattack was met with unexpected resistance from their own forces. Former allies now fought on the side of the rebels, rendering their organized efforts useless. Humanity had found an advantage, and they weren't about to let it slip away. Earth's fleet fought with a vengeance, the plasma cannons and railguns cutting through the Varine ships like they were paper. The chaos within the Varine ranks only increased the desperation of the attack. Korvath's efforts to rally his forces were falling apart. Rebel factions inside the fleet were growing bolder, undermining his leadership from within. As the battle raged on, the Varine fleet was decimated. Korvath, watching his last chance to reclaim the Imperium slip through his fingers, knew the end was near. Earth's forces were relentless, cutting down the Varine's remaining ships one by one. The Varine Imperium, the empire that had once ruled the galaxy with an iron fist, was now in full retreat. Korvath, in his final act of desperation, ordered a full retreat, hoping to preserve what little of the fleet remained, but it was too late. Earth's remaining forces pressed forward, destroying the last remnants of the Imperium's power. Korvath's ship, the Siphon, was cut off from the retreating fleet, surrounded on all sides by the remnants of Earth's forces. The final battle took place in close-quarters combat. Earth ships launched boarding actions, fighters tearing through the wreckage of Varine ships in debris-filled dogfights. The once invincible Varine ships now looked like shattered toys, the sharp, cold edges of their once perfect structures twisted and broken in the debris-strewn void. In the final moments, Korvath's flagship was pierced by a final railgun shot, its hull shattering under the immense force of the impact. As the Varian flagship disintegrated, the war officially ended. The Varians' defeat was absolute. The Imperium, which had once been the terror of the galaxy, was now nothing more than a hollow memory. As Earth's remaining forces turned to survey the devastation, the realization set in. Humanity had won. The Varine Imperium was finished, its fleet destroyed, its leadership scattered. The galaxy's power balance had shifted. The rebellion had not just crippled the Varine, it had rebuilt humanity's place in the stars. For the first time, Earth had proven that even the mightiest empire could be brought down, not by raw military strength, but by intelligence, resilience, and the courage to stand up to a force that had never been challenged before. The Varine's last stand was over. The galaxy had changed, and humanity was no longer an afterthought. It was now a force in its own right, a force capable of shaping the future of the universe. The Varine Imperium had once stood as an indomitable force, a colossus that ruled the stars with an iron fist. But now it was no more. Its fleets had been shattered, its fleets obliterated by their own overconfidence. The Varine High Command had crumbled under the weight of rebellion from within, its once immovable structures collapsing in the wake of defeat. As the last remnants of the Varine war machine drifted into the void, the galaxy could finally breathe again. The Varine Imperium no longer existed, its heart torn apart by the very systems it had imposed for centuries. Internal rebellions, once silenced by the Varine's brutal efficiency, had exploded across their once subjugated worlds. Entire systems that had bowed before them for centuries were now claiming their freedom, no longer cowed by the threats of their former masters. The Galactic Dominion was fracturing. The chains that had bound the universe together for so long now shattered. For humanity, the end of the war marked the beginning of something far more profound. Earth, which had once been a fragile and isolated planet, was now a force in the galaxy, one that no empire could ignore. No longer the underdog, Earth had fought back with everything it had: intelligence, strategy, and a refusal to submit. Earth's victory over the Varine wasn't just the result of military might. It had been won by intellect, by the genius of one man, Dax Renor, who had uncovered the Varine's fatal flaw. Dax had shown the galaxy that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their weapons or fleets, but in their ability to outthink their enemies, to turn the Varine's arrogance into their own weapon. Dax's discovery had turned a seemingly hopeless defense into a galactic upheaval. With the Varine's fall, Earth began to redefine its place in the galaxy. It wasn't just a survivor anymore. It was a power in its own right. The United Earth Alliance formed a new coalition with the rebel factions who had risen from the ashes of the Varine's broken empire. Former enemies now found common ground, uniting in a shared cause to never allow such an invasion to happen again. Earth's space programs flourished, advancing rapidly with the Varine technology they had salvaged. Humanity's defenses were reinforced with plasma shields, quantum drives, and other technologies that had once been out of reach. Earth's position in galactic politics shifted, its newfound influence drawing the attention of other systems. Diplomatic delegations from across the galaxy began to approach Earth, seeking alliances, trade agreements, and partnerships. The once forgotten species of Earth were now respected, their power shifting the balance of power across the stars. No longer would they cower in fear. Humanity had proven itself as a force to be reckoned with. And then there was Dax. He had become a legend, not just for the role he played in breaking the Varine's perfect synchronization, but for the legacy he left behind. His name would forever be associated with the victory over the Varine Imperium. In every corner of the galaxy, from the rebel strongholds to the core systems, Dax's story was told. A disgraced scientist, once cast aside, had brought down an empire with nothing but the power of his mind. Humanity didn't win by force alone. They had won by using the enemy's arrogance against them. But as the galaxy continued to evolve, Dax chose a different path. He refused the accolades, the medals, the praise. He didn't seek glory. His work was done. Humanity had won, and the future was theirs. He quietly disappeared into the vastness of space, knowing that his role in history was now secure. The legacy of Dax Renor would live on, not through the medals he never wore, but in the galaxy's newfound respect for humanity. The galaxy had learned a crucial lesson from the Varine's defeat: never underestimate humanity. The Varine had assumed they were invincible, that their technological supremacy made them untouchable. They had underestimated Earth's ability to adapt, to fight with brilliant ingenuity rather than brute strength. The Varine's collapse was a testament to the fact that no empire was truly invulnerable, not even one so feared and powerful. As Earth's role in the galaxy expanded, the Imperium's former colonies looked to humanity not just as a new power, but as a symbol of the kind of force that could topple even the most established regimes. Earth wasn't just rebuilding, it was shaping the future, ensuring that this new age would be built on the principles of freedom, unity, and the willingness to fight for survival. Humanity had learned something valuable. Earth didn't fight fair. It fought to win. And the galaxy, now forever altered by their unexpected triumph, would never forget that lesson. As the galactic balance shifted and humanity's place in the stars was solidified, the final victory wasn't just in the physical defeat of the Varine, but in the legacy of what they had done. Humanity had faced a threat unlike any other, and they had risen above it with wit, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to survival. The victory over the Varine Imperium was a turning point in history, not just for Earth, but for all species that had suffered under the weight of tyrannical empires. The galaxy would never forget, and humanity would no longer be underestimated. What do you think humanity's next move will be after such an incredible victory? Could Earth become the galaxy's next powerhouse, or will new challenges arise? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories.